The night air in the Mojave Desert was a vacuum of oppressive silence, broken only by the low, constant hum of the transmission tower. 23-year-old Elias Thorne adjusted the thermal goggles strapped over his worn baseball cap, the greenish glow illuminating the rocky, desolate terrain around him. His job, a solo, week-long monitoring stint at the decommissioned Whisper Creek Communication Facility, a relic of the Cold War with a reputation darker than the surrounding wilderness. Elias wasn't superstitious. He was an engineering graduate student, broke, and desperately needing the cash the obscure defense contractor was offering. His task was simple: monitor the station's remaining geophysical sensors, check for ground instability, and log the results. The isolation was the hardest part. The nearest town was 70 miles away that he climbed the rusted ladder to the main equipment shack, a low, prefabricated structure smelling of ozone and mildew. Inside, the control panel was a riot of flickering vacuum tubes and dust-caked dials. The main console, an ancient, analog beast the size of a refrigerator, was designated the beacon. It was supposed to be completely inert. Elias booted up the monitoring system. The screens flickered to life, displaying seismic data, atmospheric pressure, and soil temperature. Everything was flat, normal, and boring. That he poured a cup of lukewarm coffee and settled into the uncomfortable chair, pulling out his laptop to start on his thesis. A few minutes later, a sharp, almost painful crackle of static erupted from the beacon. Elias jumped, slopping coffee down his shirt that he spun around. The screen on the beacon, dark moments before, was now displaying something, a grainy, black and white feed. "What the?" he muttered, standing up. "That thing's been off the grid for decades." The image was pure, chaotic static, a violent blizzard of white noise. But beneath the snow, something pulsed. Elias leaned closer, squinting. It wasn't the usual white noise pattern. It was a rhythmic interference, like a heartbeat. Thump thump, thump thump. He located the main power switch for the unit and flipped it. Nothing. The static continued to hiss. He found the emergency override and hammered the button. Still nothing. The machine was drawing power from a source he couldn't identify. Then, the static began to coalesce. It didn't clear up, it compressed. The random noise didn't vanish, it shaped itself, forming a crude, pixelated image. Elias's breath hitched. The image was a doorway. A tall, narrow doorway, black as pitch, seemingly leading into an abyss. There was no frame, no walls, just the perfectly rectangular void dominating the center of the screen. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the doorway on the screen. It was too fast to be human, too fluid. It was a blur of movement, tall and unnaturally elongated. It seemed to hesitate at the threshold, an outline against the deeper blackness. Elias fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking, but the NO service icon mocked him. He was completely alone. The thing on the screen was now moving. Slowly. It wasn't walking, it was oozing into the frame, a silhouette made of pure darkness, absorbing the light around it. It had limbs, but they were disjointed, too long, ending in what looked like clusters of sharp, grasping needles, and then, it stopped moving. It stood perfectly still, facing the camera, or whatever was broadcasting the feed. A high-pitched, almost subsonic whine vibrated through the shack, making Elias's teeth ache. The screen's image glitched violently. When it stabilized, the entity was still there, but now its head, a smooth, featureless oval, was tilted, as if examining the viewer, and then, the entity did something impossible. It didn't move forward. It moved deeper into the background. Elias watched in horror as the sharp needles on its hands began to scratch at the edges of the image, the static itself. It wasn't scratching the glass of the monitor, it was scratching the feed. The image began to tear, creating jagged lines of pure white light. Like a mirror cracking, the moment the first tear appeared, Elias felt a change in the room. The oppressive silence outside was replaced by a low, distant rumble, a sound too deep to be thunder, too constant to be an earthquake. That he backed away from the beacon, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to get out, he had to radio in, he had to understand what the hell he was looking at. He reached the door, his hand already on the latch. The screen on the beacon flashed one final, blinding burst of white, and across the pristine black of the entity's torso, a single word resolved itself, written in an alien, pulsating red: Elias. Elias Thorne didn't wait for the red text to dissipate. The sound of his own name, appearing on a screen linked to an unknown, predatory entity, was a shock that momentarily paralyzed him. But the sheer terror of that impossible word finally propelled him into action that he yanked the door open and stumbled out onto the metal walkway. The night air, seconds ago silent, was now thick with the low, persistent rumble he had heard. It felt less like sound and more like a physical pressure, vibrating through his boots that he looked back at the control shack. The windows were dark. The beacon had finally shut down, the ominous feed gone. It was just a cold, inert box again. Elias ran down the ladder, his mind racing. A defense contractor. Geophysical sensors. The beacon. This wasn't just a glitch or an urban legend. Someone had built this thing, and someone was trying to talk through it, or rather, something was trying to claw its way out of it. That he sprinted towards his rented pickup, parked 50 yards away. But as he reached the driver's side, the rumble intensified, culminating in a sharp clang that echoed from beneath the equipment shack. That it sounded exactly like a heavy steel door slamming shut. Elias froze. The blueprints he'd reviewed showed only the ground-level shack and the tower base. There was no basement, no sub-level structure listed. Driven by a morbid curiosity that warred with his instinct for self-preservation, he cautiously walked back. He circled the shack, shining his flashlight over the cracked concrete foundation. That he found it tucked into the shadow of the main transmission tower, a barely noticeable seam in the concrete, covered by a thin layer of wind-blown sand. He nudged the sand away with his boot, revealing a rusted, circular handle. It was an access hatch, perfectly concealed. Elias crouched down, heart pounding. The air rushing up from the gap around the hatch smelled metallic and intensely cold, a shocking contrast to the desert night. That he pulled the handle. The seal broke with a screeching groan, and Elias had to put his shoulder into it to swing the heavy metal circle open. A dark stairwell, carved into the bedrock, descended into pitch black. A single, bare light bulb hung from a wire above the top step. He flipped a nearby switch, and the weak, sickly yellow light barely pierced the gloom below. "This is a trap," a voice screamed in his head. "Run!" But the image of the scratching entity and the glowing, personalized message held him captive. He had to know what was in the basement. He had to find a clue that explained the beacon. Clutching his heavy-duty flashlight, Elias descended the stairs. The air immediately became heavy, thick with the musty odor of old paper, dust, and something else, something sharp and chemically sterile, like an abandoned hospital. The stairwell opened into a single, large room with low ceilings. It wasn't a bunker or a maintenance area, it was a bizarre, makeshift archive. Rows upon rows of shelving were lined with identical, unlabeled metal canisters, reels of tape, and stacks of brittle files. In the center of the room stood a single table, bathed in the sickly yellow light. On the table was a battered, reel-to-reel tape recorder and a cardboard box. Elias approached the table, kicking up dust with every step. He shined his light on the box. It was filled with old audio cassette tapes. They weren't labeled with names or project codes, but with dates and durations: 1962.03.14, 11 to 321.971.09.28, 05 to 001985.11.05, 003, and then, at the top of the pile, a fresh-looking tape, starkly different from the rest. This last tape was labeled in modern handwriting with a black marker: November 5, 2025, midnight inch. Today's date, midnight. Elias felt a chill colder than the air. The realization hit him: the rumble, the static, the image, the name, it was all a prearranged sequence. Someone, decades ago, or perhaps very recently, knew this was going to happen. He picked up the newest tape. It was an empty cassette. Then, his eyes fell on the reel-to-reel machine. There was a tape already threaded on the spools. Elias leaned closer to read the tiny, faded label. It read, "Project Beacon, Danger, Do Not Play." Beneath the warning, a date was scratched in, 1978.10.31. Elias hesitated, his hand hovering over the play button. His entire rational world screamed at him to stop. But the burning red word, Elias, on the screen demanded answers. He had been witnessed that he took a deep breath, pressed the heavy, clunking play button, and the reel-to-reel began to spin, the mechanism whirring to life. For a moment, there was only the low hiss of the tape, then, a voice, deep and gravelly, started speaking. Log 34, Halloween night. The system is fully operational. We're broadcasting the feed now. This is a final attempt to establish a viable link. We have confirmation that the signal is penetrating the outer threshold. We are waiting for an acknowledgement. God help us if they are able to reply in kind. The voice trailed off, replaced by the faint sound of the desert wind. Then, a new sound began to creep in. It was the same, rhythmic thump-thump, thump-thump, that Elias had heard on the beacon screen, but raw, unfiltered, and intensely close. The recording crackled, and the gravelly voice returned, now tight with panic. It worked. Oh my God, it worked. The static, it's not random. It's forming a structure. We're getting feedback, visual feedback. I swear it's a door. Abort. Abort the broadcast. It's reacting to the sound. The entity is listening to our audio frequency. Shut it do. The tape ended abruptly in a blinding shriek of white noise, exactly like the final burst on the beacon screen. Elias tore his hand away from the machine. He had just heard a man's final, terrified moments, confirming that the entity was somehow tied to the audio frequency of the beacon. He looked back at the table, his eyes wide. The box of cassette tapes. Dates and durations. The November 5, 2025 tape. He snatched the modern tape and jammed it into his portable recorder. He pressed play. Silence. Complete, total silence. A blank tape, but as he listened, the silence began to change. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the presence of nothing. It was the sound of the deep, empty void behind the doorway on the screen. Then, the profound silence was broken by a soft, wet scrape that seemed to come not from the recorder's speakers, but from somewhere close by, just outside the radius of the yellow light. Elias whipped around, shining his powerful flashlight into the shadows of the archive. The light fell across the towering shelves of metal canisters, and then, he saw it point. One of the canisters, near the back wall, was vibrating violently. Not rattling, it was shaking itself off the shelf. The lid popped off, and a thin, needle-like protrusion, impossibly long and sharp, reached out from the container and began to scratch the bare concrete floor. It was the same sound he'd witnessed the entity make on the screen, tearing at the feed. But this time, it was tearing at reality itself, right behind him. Next, Elias realizes the archives are a prison, and the cassette tapes are audio decoys. He must use the blank tape to counter the entity's frequency, leading to a dangerous chase through the claustrophobic corridors of the facility. The wet scrape echoed again, louder this time. Elias didn't need to shine his flashlight back at the canister, the sound was unmistakable. It was the sound of the entity's grasping appendages, the needles, testing the prison walls that he was trapped. The archives weren't just a discovery, they were the secondary containment for the thing in the static. His mind flashed back to the newest tape, November 5, 2025, midnight. Today's date. Midnight. The tape was completely blank, playing pure, unsettling silence. The entity is listening to our audio frequency. The dead scientist's panicked voice echoed in his memory. Elias stared at the blank cassette in his portable recorder. The other tapes, labeled with past dates, were decoys. They contained the terrifying last moments of the previous operators, audio recordings of the entity's initial breakthrough, designed to be played at specific moments in time to keep the entity anchored and distracted. The project wasn't about communication, it was about containment via distraction frequency. The current date, November 5, 2025, required a different tactic. The blank tape wasn't empty, it was the active component. Its silence wasn't nothing, it was a specific, null frequency, a sonic void meant to confuse or neutralize the entity's ability to listen its way through the barrier. Scrape. Scrape, the sound was closer now, accompanied by a low, guttural clicking sound from behind the tall metal shelves. Elias's engineering mind took over, overriding his panic. If the entity was drawn to the audio, to the signal, he could control it. He had a mobile sound source that he ripped the blank tape out of the portable recorder, ran to the nearest heavy-duty metal shelf, and jammed the recorder into a gap between two storage bins. He flipped the recorder on play and turned the volume to max, positioning the small speaker to face the back wall. The null-frequency silence began broadcasting into the room. Immediately, the deep clicking and scraping sounds from behind the shelf stopped. A chilling, momentary vacuum of silence fell over the archive. It's working. It's focusing on the blank signal. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed the reel-to-reel tape, the one labeled "Danger," and shoved it into his backpack. He needed proof. He needed to get out. He sprinted towards the stairs, his flashlight beam bouncing frantically off the shelves. The moment he reached the base of the stairs, the low, powerful rumble returned, a massive pressure wave that felt like a punch to the chest. Then, from the spot where he'd left the portable recorder, a sound unlike any he had ever heard erupted, a high-pitched, digitized scream, not of pain, but of pure, digital rage, tearing through the speaker. The silence had been broken. He looked back. The portable recorder exploded in a shower of plastic shrapnel, and standing where the shelves had been, in the spot now illuminated by his flashlight, was the witness. It was just as he had seen it on the beacon screen, but real. A towering, impossibly thin silhouette, its surface a swirling mass of shimmering black pixels, solid and vaporous all at once. Its elongated limbs ended in the clusters of needle-like fingers, which now dragged along the concrete, leaving oily, black scorch marks. The entity had followed the audio. It was here, its smooth, featureless head tilted again, mimicking the motion on the screen. The rumbling grew to a deafening roar as the air around the creature became visibly distorted, like heat rising off asphalt. Elias scrambled up the stone stairs, his feet slipping on the dusty rock. The entity didn't run. It moved with a horrifying, smooth glide, a noiseless, impossible acceleration up the stairs behind him. Elias threw himself through the open hatch and onto the main floor of the shack. He yanked the heavy metal circle shut and slammed the rusted deadbolt across it just as a shattering thud hit the metal directly beneath him, making the entire shack shake. He jumped back, gasping, staring at the floor. The metal access hatch was now glowing cherry red where the entity had struck it. The entity wasn't trying to physically break the seal, it was broadcasting a lethal, localized frequency overload into the metal. Elias ran out the door and didn't stop until he reached his truck. He scrambled inside, locked the doors, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine caught instantly, but as his headlights cut through the desert night, the beam didn't reach the transmission tower. The light was being swallowed by a perfectly rectangular patch of absolute blackness that now seemed to hover around the tower's base. It looked exactly like the door he had seen on the beacon. Then, a new sound came over the truck's radio, overriding every frequency, the distinct, low thump-thump of the entity's heartbeat signal. On the passenger seat, his phone suddenly lit up. No signal, but a new alert flashed on the screen, bypassing the OS entirely, replacing the lock screen. Signal received from $whisper.creek.00 message, you have taken the archive. The frequency is yours. You cannot leave the field. Elias looked up. The road leading out of the facility, the only road connecting him to the outside world, was now completely blocked. A colossal wall of static, a shimmering curtain of black and white visual noise, 40 feet high and stretching across the entire width of the road, had materialized. He was trapped inside the frequency field. The witness was playing a game, and he had just taken the most dangerous piece. Next, Elias realizes the frequency field is actively distorting reality. He discovers a secret compartment in the truck left by the contractor, containing a cryptic letter, a map to an abandoned relay station, and a warning that the witness is now broadcasting through him. Elias slammed the truck into reverse, tires spitting gravel as he backed away from the impassable wall of static. The sheer volume of the static heartbeat coming from the radio was deafening, the air thick with the smell of ozone. He knew, with terrifying certainty, that this wasn't an illusion. It was a tangible barrier, the entity's signature frequency made manifest. He was locked in. He killed the engine and the radio immediately went silent. The resulting stillness was even more unnerving, a heavy, dead atmosphere under the oppressive gaze of the transmission tower. Elias gripped the steering wheel, trying to regain control. The witness hadn't just pursued him, it had rewired the environment to contain him, confirming its intelligence and its malicious intent. The frequency is yours. You cannot leave the field. His eyes fell on the backpack containing the reel-to-reel tape, his only physical proof. He then noticed something metallic glinting beneath the driver's seat. He reached down and pulled out a small, heavy-duty Pelican case, secured with a combination lock. This wasn't his. The contractor must have placed it here. That he examined the lock. There were 4 dials. Thinking back to the old audio tape, he tried the date of the last recorded log before the shriek, 1-9-7-8. The lock clicked open. Inside, the case contained 3 items: handwritten note, sealed in a plastic sleeve, a detailed topographical map of the Mojave region, a small, military-grade GPS tracker, currently displaying his exact location at Whisper Creek. Elias tore open the note first. The handwriting was neat, meticulous, and chillingly resigned. Elias, if you are reading this, the deployment failed. I know you were hired for a simple monitoring job, but your specific frequency signature was required for the final stage. The entity, which the original project team designated the witness, is not a ghost or a demon. It is a localized anomaly of nonlinear communication, attracted to coherent signals and fueled by chaotic audio feedback that we failed to contain it in 1978. The archives were a desperate attempt to create audio decoys and a sonic dampener, the blank tape. It was a holding pattern. When the witness spoke your name, it established a symbiotic link. You didn't just take the frequency, the witness is now broadcasting through you. The static barrier is merely a projection of your own fear, channeled by the entity. You are the new beacon. There is only one way to break the link and collapse the field. You must reach Relay Station Gamma 14. It's the last active listening post capable of transmitting a counter-frequency pulse strong enough to overload the witness's connection to the physical world. The location is marked on the map, but be warned, the witness knows its only way out is through you. It will use your senses to hunt you. Trust nothing that you hear or see within the field. Dr. A.V., Project Lead, 1978. Elias dropped the note, his skin crawling. You are the new beacon. The realization was a fresh wave of terror. The entity wasn't just near him, it was riding his nervous system, using his fear to solidify its presence. That he grabbed the map and the GPS unit. The map was old, faded, showing the Whisper Creek facility and a line drawn in red ink, leading 45 miles northeast across treacherous, unmarked terrain to a point labeled G14. That he had to move. He was a captive inside his own horror movie, and the director was the monster. He threw the truck into drive and sped away from the static wall, heading towards the open desert, guided by the crude red line on the map. 10 minutes later, he was deep in the barren, moonlit expanse. The drive was a nightmare of sudden drops and hidden rocks. He kept the radio off, desperate to avoid the heartbeat frequency. Suddenly, a massive, deafening bang resonated right next to his ear. Elias screamed, swerving the truck. He slammed on the brakes, breathing heavily. He spun around, checking the passenger window. Nothing. There was no impact point on the truck, no debris, nothing. The sound had been perfectly localized, entirely inside the cab. Trust nothing that you hear or see within the field. The witness was testing him, projecting auditory hallucinations using his own senses as the antennae. Elias pressed his hands over his ears, shaking his head. It's not real. It's not real. He forced himself to start the truck again, driving slowly, eyes darting between the map, the GPS, and the empty blackness of the desert. He managed another mile before the next projection hit him. On the passenger seat, right beside him, the reel-to-reel tape in his backpack started playing the recording of the screaming scientist. Abort. Abort the broadcast. It's reacting to the sound. Shut it. The sound was so real, so immediate, that Elias instinctively grabbed the tape to silence it, but his fingers passed straight through the illusion. The sound continued, the scientist's final terror echoing in the cab. Elias realized the true horror. He wasn't just hearing a memory, he was experiencing the entity's projection of the exact frequency of a man's death, broadcast directly into his mind that he accelerated, flooring the pedal. The truck bounced wildly over the uneven ground. As he drove, a flicker of movement caught his attention in the side view mirror. Reflected in the small glass rectangle, perfectly centered, was the image of the witness. It was not following the truck, it was standing still, towering over the desert landscape, its needle fingers raised, but what caused Elias's blood to run cold was the reflection in the driver's side window. The witness was wearing his baseball cap, and as he watched in the mirror, the entity's featureless head slowly lowered, and it placed its cluster of sharp, needle-like fingers over the reflection of the truck's windshield. A thin, high-pitched screech, not of sound, but of vibrating glass, began. Elias looked forward, and where the witness's reflection was pressing on the glass, a hairline crack instantly appeared, then spiderwebbed across the entire windshield. The entity wasn't just an image anymore. It was learning to use the physical world through Elias's panicked attention that he was the conduit. Next, the shattered windshield forces Elias to drive blind in the dark. The GPS unit begins displaying impossible coordinates, and the entity starts manipulating the truck's electronics, leading Elias to the edge of an ancient, deep canyon that wasn't on the map. The spiderweb of cracks across the windshield fractured the moonlight into 1,000 dancing shards, forcing Elias to slow the truck to a crawl. He was navigating by flashlight and sheer nerve, the desert landscape a confusing blur of rocks and shadows. He had to assume the witness was constantly manipulating his perception, broadcasting threats into his auditory and visual centers. The entities wearing his cap, his sign of identity, was a psychological attack, a grotesque statement. It had taken him over. He glanced at the GPS unit on the passenger seat. The little red beacon marking his position was still moving, heading roughly towards G14, but the coordinates displayed were starting to degrade. The numbers flickered violently. 35.1234 N, 116.7890 W became 35.1234 N, 116.7890 W, then abruptly shifted to 35.1234 N, 000.0000 W followed by a random stream of binary code. The witness was actively corrupting the signal. Elias slapped the unit, hoping to reset it. The screen flashed the message he had received earlier: signal received from whispered.creek.00. A deep, nonverbal pressure pulsed in Elias's head, and the numbers on the GPS settled into a new, stable reading: 35.1234 N, 116.7890 W followed by a new line of text: turn left now. The field wants you to leave the road. Elias felt a surge of cold doubt. The note warned him to trust nothing. The map clearly showed the trajectory straight ahead, but the GPS was screaming at him to turn 90 degrees left, directly toward a looming, dark ridge. He forced himself to follow the map, ignoring the digital command. He kept driving straight, grinding the gears as the terrain worsened. Warning: failure to comply will result in field collapse. The message flashed aggressively on the GPS. At the same moment, the truck's dashboard lights began to strobe, a blinding disco of red and blue that disoriented Elias completely. The engine note rose and fell erratically, and the steering wheel briefly locked, pulling the truck hard to the left. It's controlling the truck's electronics. Elias fought the wheel, his muscles screaming against the sudden mechanical resistance. He managed to keep it straight, narrowly missing a jagged outcrop of rock. He was battling a malicious AI that had infected the local electrical grid. He slammed his fist onto the ignition, killing the engine and plunging the cab into total darkness and silence. The GPS screen immediately went black. Breathing heavily, Elias pulled the keys out of the ignition. He wouldn't let it drive him. He was now dependent on his flashlight and the printed map. He got out of the truck, taking only his backpack and the flashlight. He looked towards the ridge the GPS had pointed to. The entire line of the ridge, about half a mile away, was shimmering slightly, vibrating like hot air. Only this was a cold, alien distortion. He started walking, keeping the map oriented under the flashlight's beam. His leg snagged on something. He shined the light down. It was a strip of discarded, rusty rebar. He looked up, and then he saw it. The ground had vanished. 40 feet in front of him, the desert landscape abruptly ended in a sheer, vertical drop. It wasn't a small wash or a ravine, it was an immense, jagged canyon, kilometers wide, carving a deep, black fissure through the Mojave floor. There was no sound coming from the void, only a bottomless darkness that swallowed the light. This canyon wasn't on the map. Elias checked the topographical map again. The area he was standing in should have been flat, continuous plain for another 5 miles. The witness hadn't controlled his truck to make him turn left, it had been trying to guide him around a reality-breaking hazard that it had manifested in his path. The entity was playing a terrifying game of manipulation, creating a physical threat and then offering a compromised solution. As Elias cautiously approached the canyon edge, the air around the fissure grew colder, heavy with a silence that pressed on his eardrums. He shined his light across the canyon. The beam was instantly lost in the depth, but for a split second, he saw something else. Across the impossible void, high up on the opposite ridge, stood the flickering silhouette of the witness. It was waiting, but the fear of the drop wasn't the worst part. From the depths of the canyon, a new sound began to ascend. It wasn't the rhythmic heartbeat or the static shriek. It was softer, more insidious. It was the distinct, clear sound of a woman weeping. The sound was heartbreakingly familiar. It was the sound of his estranged mother, whom he hadn't spoken to in 2 years, her voice broken by sorrow and distance. "Elias, why did you leave? It's too dark down here. Come home." The projection was perfect, designed to exploit his deepest guilt and draw him toward the drop. The witness was using his own emotional bandwidth against him. Elias squeezed his eyes shut. "Not real," he choked out. "Not real." The weeping intensified, morphing into a pleading wail, seemingly coming from the abyss right beneath his feet. He took a step back, focusing on the map. He needed to find a path around this impossible canyon. The projected emotional manipulation was the most dangerous threat yet. He forced himself to look away from the void, back at the truck he'd abandoned. In that moment of distraction, the canyon edge shifted. He heard a low crunch beneath his boot. He looked down. He was no longer standing on dusty bedrock. He was standing on a flat, perfectly reflective surface, a vast pane of polished black glass, that stretched to the edge of the void, and reflected perfectly in the surface. Staring up at him from the impossible depth of the canyon, was a towering, needle-fingered entity wearing his cap, not across the void, but directly beneath his feet. Next, Elias realizes the black glass is a solidified projection of the witness's doorway. He discovers he is standing on a dimensional fault line and must find the physical weakness in the entity's projection, leading to a desperate attempt to cross the ravine using the truck's battery as a directional countercharge. Elias held his breath, unable to move. The sheer drop was gone, replaced by the polished, obsidian surface that reflected the stars and, more terrifyingly, the towering, dark silhouette of the witness directly below him. He was standing on a mirror of absolute blackness, a sheet of solidified, hostile frequency, the physical manifestation of the doorway he'd seen on the beacon. The weeping projection was now muffled, echoing from deep within the reflected form beneath the glass. It sounded like his mother's voice trapped inside a bell jar. Elias lowered himself slowly, placing a hand on the cold, unnatural glass. It felt dense and smooth, yet emitted a faint, high-frequency vibration. He was walking on the ceiling of the entity's dimension. He had walked straight into a dimensional fault line. The witness hadn't created a canyon, it had overlaid its own reality, the deep, empty blackness of the signal source, over the Mojave Desert. The black glass was the membrane. He knew he couldn't stay on the glass. The witness was already below, pressing against the membrane, mirroring his movements, waiting for the material to thin or break. He edged backward, testing the surface with his weight. The glass held, but where his boot contacted it, a faint red glow pulsed outward, like a ripple in hot liquid. He reached the edge of the glass where it met the solid desert ground, stepping back onto the gritty, safe bedrock. The moment his feet left the black surface, the weeping sound vanished, and the reflection disappeared, leaving only the stars. The witness's projections were tied directly to the medium it controlled. He looked back at his truck, the fractured windshield gleaming under the moon. He couldn't go back, and he couldn't drive around the fault line because he couldn't see how far it stretched. He had to find a way to cross it. Elias, the engineering student, forced himself to think. The witness was an entity of frequency and signal. Its barrier was a form of contained energy. To cross it, He needed to overload or disrupt its local projection that he realized the one piece of equipment in the field designed to generate a powerful, focused charge, the truck's battery. He ran back to the vehicle, fumbling for the wrench in the toolbox. Working frantically in the dim light, he disconnected the heavy-duty battery terminals. He hauled the massive battery out, its lead casing cold and heavy. He needed to create a makeshift directional countercharge, a controlled burst of DC current strong enough to momentarily scramble the witness's local frequency field and create a safe path. He grabbed the thick jumper cables from the toolbox, unwinding them with shaking hands. The cable clamps were his electrodes. The black glass was his conductor. He walked back to the edge of the glass floor. The shimmering, distorted ridge across the way, relay station G14's estimated location, seemed impossibly far. He placed the battery on the bedrock next to the black glass. He clamped the positive jumper cable to the battery's terminal. He took the other end, the negative clamp, and threw it out onto the glass surface, aiming for the center. It landed with a dull, unnatural thud. Nothing happened. Elias knew the glass membrane needed a pathway for the current. It needed a flaw. He backed up 10 feet, picked up a heavy, sharp stone, and threw it with all his might at the glass. The stone hit the surface with a loud, ringing clink. It didn't crack. It didn't break. It simply sank into the blackness, leaving a perfectly smooth, circular indent, like a ripple in deep oil. As the ripple subsided, the witness's image reappeared beneath the indent, its featureless face staring straight up at him from the depths, and then, from the truck, Elias heard the sound of the engine cranking, slowly, painfully, impossibly, since he had the keys in his pocket. The witness was actively attempting to start the truck again, trying to use the battery's energy against him. Elias ignored the sound, focusing on the nearest, deepest crack in his environment, the broken windshield. He sprinted back to the truck, yanked off a shard of shattered glass from the windshield, and raced back to the fault line. He wasn't going to break the glass membrane, he was going to pierce it with the entity's own weapon. He held the shard, its edge razor-sharp, and drove it down into the black glass surface. This time, the sound was different, a horrible, wet hiss, like acid meeting metal. The shard pierced the surface, going in about an inch before the obsidian fused around it. A viscous, black liquid oozed out of the wound. Elias quickly jammed the negative clamp of the jumper cable onto the protruding piece of windshield glass. Boom! A massive, incandescent arc of pure white electricity exploded across the black glass. The intense current followed the negative cable, shooting outward from the point of contact towards the positive battery terminal on the ground. A path of white-hot, sizzling light, a brief, unstable bridge, opened across the black surface. The air filled with the scent of burnt circuitry and raw energy. Elias snatched the positive clamp off the battery and sprinted onto the unstable white path. He had maybe 5 seconds before the battery drained and the glass membrane healed itself. He ran across the sizzling surface, the soles of his shoes melting, the heat intense. Behind him, he heard a tremendous, digital roar of pure static, the witness reacting to the pain of the short circuit. He reached the other side, throwing himself onto the hard, stable bedrock of the opposing ridge just as the white path flickered and vanished, replaced instantly by the seamless black glass. He had crossed the void. He was closer to G14. But as he looked back at the glass, the reflection of the witness reappeared, closer this time, and faster. It was already healing, and directly next to it, the massive transmission tower of Whisper Creek began to flicker. Not with light, but with the same violent, black and white static he had seen on the beacon. The entire tower, reaching hundreds of feet into the sky, was becoming a physical antenna for the witness. Next, Elias begins the trek to G14. The witness, using the tower as a global antenna, starts projecting auditory and visual anomalies directly into the night sky, making the desert itself appear to fold and breathe, pushing Elias to the brink of insanity. Elias scrambled over the final rocks onto the high ridge, heart hammering, his lungs burning with the effort. He glanced back. The immense transmission tower at Whisper Creek, miles away, was now a vertical river of pulsing black and white visual static, dominating the skyline. It was no longer a piece of infrastructure, it was the witness's antenna, broadcasting its lethal frequency across the entire Mojave field. He checked the map, and the now-dead GPS relay station Gamma 14, G14, was still several hours away on foot, hidden somewhere in the maze of dark, monolithic rock formations ahead, Elias began to walk, clutching the map, fueled by adrenaline and the grim knowledge that he was broadcasting the enemy's signal. "You are the new beacon." The first signs of the Witness using its new, vast network weren't subtle. The desert night sky, moments ago pristine and filled with stars, began to twist. The constellations didn't move, they fractured. Lines of pure, blinding white static stitched themselves across the black canvas, connecting stars into impossible, shifting patterns. The entire atmosphere felt wrong, pressurized. Elias looked up and saw the Big Dipper suddenly dissolve into a swirling mass of black pixels, only to reform a second later as a gigantic, needle-fingered hand reaching down towards the horizon that he forced his eyes back to the ground. "It's a projection. It's light and frequency, not substance," but the visual manipulation was only the prelude. A sudden, sharp pulse of sound hit him, originating not from the ground, but from directly overhead. It was a perfect, crystalline sound, like the chiming of a massive, otherworldly clock, one single, slow toll dot clang. The sound was so potent that it felt physical. Elias instinctively crouched, clutching his head. Then, the auditory attack began in earnest. The desert silence was ripped apart by a horrifying symphony of personalized dread, all broadcast from the massive static tower. He heard the distant, muffled scrape of the entity's needles on metal, amplified and echoing off the canyons. That he heard the distorted, manic laughter of the scientist from the archived tape, stretched and pitch shifted until it sounded like a dying radio signal. He heard his own name, Elias, whispered simultaneously from every direction, bouncing off the rocks with chilling clarity. The Witness was flooding his system, overwhelming his senses with sensory input designed to trigger panic and collapse his mental fortitude. He kept walking, focusing only on the feel of the rough rock beneath his boots, trying to anchor himself in physical reality. He noticed that the terrain itself was shifting under the influence of the broadcast. The flat ground ahead of him was visibly folding in on itself, creating sudden, treacherous dips and impossible inclines that weren't there a moment before. The Witness was projecting localized gravitational or visual distortions to slow his progress. He navigated a rise only to find the next section of the ridge had become a corridor of jagged, monolithic rock columns, placed in an unnatural, deliberate pattern. As he walked between the narrow columns, a single, low-frequency sound began to emanate from the rock face beside him. It was a repeated, mechanical knocking. Knock. 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 It wasn't menacing, just persistent. Elias paused, flashlight aimed at the rock. The Witness had stopped the audio barrage and was focusing on this one simple sound. He reached out and placed his hand on the rock, feeling the subtle vibration of the knock against the stone. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. Elias breathed a sigh of relief, but then, the rock face in front of him bulged outward. The stone didn't crack, it flowed like slow, thick liquid, driven by an immense, unseen pressure from within. The bulging stopped, forming a smooth, oval projection, and then, a sound returned, a soft, wet pop, as a single, perfectly round and milky white human eye opened in the center of the smooth stone. It wasn't a projection of light or sound, it was the result of a physical, localized reality collapse, forced by the entity's power. The eye blinked slowly, staring directly at Elias, its pupil a deep, empty blackness. Then, the eye began to move, rolling upward, tracking something behind Elias, toward the static-drenched tower. A sound, faint and distorted, drifted from the massive transmission tower miles away, a sound that only the stone eye seemed to recognize. It was the distinct, rhythmic thump-thump, thump-thump, of the Witness's original heartbeat signal, but this time it sounded different. It sounded like it was getting stronger. It sounded like it was feeding. Elias tore his eyes away from the grotesque stone eye and ran, leaving the column corridor behind. He couldn't shake the chilling realization, the Witness wasn't just trying to stop him, it was actively gathering power, and the stone eye was watching its progress. As he looked ahead, the terrain cleared for a brief moment, revealing a path leading down into a bowl-shaped depression. He checked the map. This was a known landmark, an ancient dry riverbed that led directly toward the G14 area. He sprinted toward the dip, desperate for any cover, but when he reached the edge and looked down, the depression wasn't empty. It was filled with a swirling, opaque black fluid that looked like crude oil reflecting the corrupted sky, and floating in the center of the black fluid, bobbing gently, was his own backpack, the one containing the reel-to-reel tape that he hadn't dropped it. He was still wearing it, the floating backpack was a decoy, another lure. He looked down at the pack strapped to his back. It was real, physical, and heavy. He looked back at the floating pack. As he watched, the black fluid around the floating pack began to bubble, and from the center of the bubbles, a thin, needle-like finger, perfectly black, impossibly long, emerged, tapping gently on the fabric of the decoy backpack. The witness wasn't just manipulating his senses, it was testing the limits of duplication, trying to confuse him into dropping the real evidence. Next, Elias realizes the black fluid is pure, condensed frequency. He uses the real tape to confirm the frequency field's boundary, leading him to a network of abandoned mine shafts, the only way to reach G14 without crossing another dimensional fault line. He hears a voice telling him to turn back. The sight of the floating, duplicate backpack bobbing in the viscous black liquid, a physical manifestation of the witness's trickery, confirmed Elias's worst fears. The entity was rapidly gaining power and complexity. The black fluid wasn't oil or water, it was pure, condensed frequency, an active soup of the static signal. He resisted the urge to panic, his hand instinctively gripping the real backpack strapped to his shoulders. He needed to avoid this dimensional tar pit and find the true path to G14. He pulled out the reel-to-reel tape, the one labeled "Danger," from his backpack. He held the plastic casing over the edge of the fluid, like a dowsing rod. The moment the tape casing crossed an invisible boundary just above the black liquid, the tape itself began to vibrate violently, emitting a rapid, high-pitched electrical hum. The tape was acting as a physical frequency detector. Elias retreated, confirming that the fluid was a boundary. He circled the bowl-shaped depression, following the contour of the frequency field boundary, using the vibrating tape as his guide. After 20 minutes of careful, tense navigation, the perimeter of the field began to shrink, forcing Elias into a narrow choke point between two colossal rock slabs. As he squeezed through the gap, the tape stopped vibrating. The air on the other side felt subtly cleaner, quieter. He was out of the primary projection field. He checked the map again. He was now at the base of the massive formation protecting the G14 relay. The map showed the shortest route through the mountain was an old network of abandoned, unstable mine shafts. Relief warred with dread. Mine shafts were dangerous enough without a dimensional predator chasing him. He found the entrance to the largest shaft, a gaping, black hole in the rock, shored up by rotten timber that looked ready to collapse. He shined his flashlight into the gloom. The air flowing out was dry and stagnant, carrying the smell of rust and ancient dust. Elias took a tentative step toward the entrance. "You're making a mistake, Elias." The voice was low, rational, and came from directly behind him. It was a completely new voice, calm, authoritative, and distinctly male, with a faint, mid-Atlantic accent. Elias whirled around, flashlight beams sweeping across the empty desert night. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I am not showing myself. I am attempting to advise you," the voice continued, still calm, still right behind his head. "The relay station is the destination of the old protocol. The witness has adapted. G14 is no longer the solution, it is the trap." Elias realized this was the witness's most dangerous projection yet, the voice of a trusted authority figure, speaking logic and reason, appealing to his academic mind. "Who are you?" Elias demanded, backing slowly toward the mine entrance. "I am the frequency of stability. I am what remains of the original project's safety countermeasures. You overload G14, you collapse the field, but you will also trigger the release," the voice warned, the tone laced with regret. "The entity's true anchor is deeper. Don't go into the ground. Turn back. Drive to the nearest town. You are the beacon now, use your signal to lead it away." Elias stopped. The argument was dangerously compelling. But he remembered the note from Dr. V, and the panicked last words on the tape. The original project lead was desperate to overload the system. "You're lying," Elias stated, though his confidence was paper-thin. "You're trying to keep me from the counterpulse." The voice sighed, a gentle, disappointed sound. "Suit yourself, student." But in the dark, where every sound echoes, your conviction will falter." The voice vanished. Silence returned, heavier than before. Elias swallowed hard. He had to trust the dead scientist over the smooth, synthetic voice of the witness. He stepped into the mine shaft, the rotting timbers groaning under the shift in weight that he began his descent, following the gentle downward slope of the shaft. The air grew immediately cooler and tighter. The beam of his flashlight revealed rough-hewn walls and rails for long-gone mining carts that he hadn't walked 50 feet when the sound started, a repeating, sharp clang. Clang, echoing from the dark recesses of the shaft below. It sounded like metal hitting metal, like a heavy tool being dropped and bouncing down the rail tracks. Elias froze, listening. It's just an echo. That he took another step, the clanging stopped. It was replaced by the terrifying, familiar sound of the entity's rhythmic thump-thump heartbeat, this time accompanied by a new, wet slurp sound, as if something massive and slick was dragging itself along the earthen floor. Elias tried to speed up, navigating a sharp turn. His flashlight beam fell upon a wall niche. Resting neatly on a shelf carved into the rock was an old, rusted metal lunchbox that he approached it cautiously and opened the latch. Inside, resting on a wax paper liner, was a half-eaten peanut butter and jelly sandwich, still impossibly fresh, surrounded by a faint, sickly sweet aroma. Elias froze, his blood turning to ice. He had made that exact sandwich for dinner before leaving. It was a mundane, intimate, and impossibly personal detail the witness could only know if it had completely scoured his mind. The calm voice returned, whispering directly into his inner ear, "We know your comforts, Elias. And we know your fears." Elias slammed the lunchbox shut, his heart racing. He turned and plunged deeper into the mine, abandoning any pretense of stealth that he was running now, down the slick, echoing passage. As he ran, the distant, calm voice was replaced by 1,000 overlapping whispers, each one his own voice, speaking his deepest secrets, his most private anxieties, amplified and thrown back at him by the echoing shaft. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a large, subterranean cavern. Elias stopped short dead in the center of the cavern, impossibly illuminated by a ghostly, green glow, was a colossal, natural quartz formation. It was massive, crystalline, and radiating the sickly light, and suspended in the center of the quartz, like a fly in amber, was a perfectly preserved, petrified human body, the original scientist from the 1978 tape, his face frozen in a permanent mask of screaming terror. Next, Elias realizes the quartz is the witness's true, deep earth anchor, and the petrified body is the final log. The entity, manifesting as a distorted reflection in the quartz, gives Elias a cryptic choice: overload the relay or destroy the anchor, forcing him into a final, deadly decision. Elias's scream was swallowed by the immense space of the cavern. The green light emanating from the quartz formation cast deep, dancing shadows, making the cavern walls seem to writhe. He stood paralyzed, his flashlight beam trembling over the horrific display in the center of the chamber. The man encased in the crystalline prison, the scientist from the 1978 log, was not merely a fossil. His clothing was intact, his face etched with pure, final terror, his hand reaching out, desperately, toward the cavern entrance. This was the ultimate end result of the original project, the perfect, permanent capture. Elias realized the terrifying truth: the massive quartz formation was the witness's true, deep earth anchor. The transmission tower was its antenna, but this crystal was the physical link, allowing the entity to draw power and project its influence over the frequency field. The man in the quartz was the final, tragic log, a testament to what happens when the witness achieves true physical stability. The calm, authoritative male voice returned, booming not from his mind, but resonating off the quartz itself, a perfect, synthetic echo of authority. "Observe, Elias. This is the consequence of Project Beacon's hubris. They sought to communicate across dimensions. They found only consumption." Elias slowly raised his flashlight to the petrified man's hand. Clutched in the crystalline grasp was a single, small object, a brass-plated key. Ignoring the roaring voice, Elias approached the quartz, the sheer cold radiating from the crystal intense. He had to get that key. That he pressed his fingers against the cold, smooth quartz. As he touched it, the surface immediately rippled, forming a perfect, fluid reflection of Elias's face, overlaid by the elongated, needle-fingered shadow of the witness. The voice addressed him through the reflection, speaking with Elias's own voice. "You have a choice, Beacon. The path of the engineer, or the path of the destroyer." The reflection shifted. In the crystalline surface, two separate images appeared, flickering with static, G14 relay, showing the distant relay station, ready to be powered up, the air around it pulsating with electrical energy. The witness reflection looked stressed, agitated by this image. Quartz anchor, showing the massive crystal in front of him, and a small, precise incision point marked in pulsating red light. The witness reflection looked calm, almost indifferent to this option. The voice explained the deadly ultimatum: the G14 relay will overload the external frequency field. It will banish the witness from the Mojave, but the core essence, the anchor, will remain. And it will continue to attract new beacons. You will be free, but others will die. The quartz anchor is the source. Destroy it, and the witness is permanently severed from this dimension. But the collapse will be localized, powerful, and instantaneous. You will not survive the implosion of the dimensional fault line. Elias looked at the key. The key was the tool needed to choose one of these two destructive paths that he knew what the witness wanted. It wanted him to choose the relay, to save himself, to preserve the anchor, and ensure its continued existence. The calm voice, the reasonable tone, it was all designed to steer him toward the selfish option. The petrified scientist, eyes wide with horror, seemed to silently beg Elias to choose differently. Elias put his hand on the quartz again, focused not on the reflection of the witness, but on the frozen, desperate grip of the dead man. With a grunt of effort, he forced his fingers around the brass key, wrenching it free from the crystalline prison. The quartz shrieked, a high, thin sound like ripping steel, but the key came loose as he backed away, the key warm in his hand. He wasn't going to be the engineer who ran. He was going to be the destroyer. "You said I was the beacon," Elias choked out, staring into the witness reflection. "If I broadcast the signal, I'll take you with me." The calm voice hesitated, replaced by a surge of pure, violent static. Crackling from the quartz. "You will not sacrifice yourself. Your data is too valuable." Elias turned and began running deeper into the mineshaft, the key heavy in his palm. He needed to find a tool, something capable of destroying a giant crystal, and he needed to get to the relay to perform the counterpulse before the witness solidified its presence completely. He needed to keep both options open for now that he ran for several minutes until he reached a crossroads. One passage led sharply upward, the path to the relay station, G14. The other led deeper down, marked on his map as an old dynamite storage room that he didn't need to think. He needed an explosive. He needed the power of 1,000 suns to destroy the witness's anchor that he took the downward path toward the storage room. As he did, a new sound erupted behind him in the cavern, a heavy, splintering crack. The witness, enraged, was breaking the quartz to release the rest of the petrified body. Elias didn't look back. He ran until he reached the heavy, reinforced door of the storage room. He jammed the brass key into the lock and turned. The heavy tumbler clicked open that he slammed the door open and shone his light inside. It was a small room, dry and perfectly preserved. Against the back wall stood stacked boxes of ancient, unstable TNT, but before he could grab a fuse, the entire storage room plunged into darkness. The flashlight, the only source of light, went dead in his hand. The witness hadn't just killed the power, it had disabled the one piece of equipment that relied only on a standalone battery. A low, guttural hum filled the darkness. The air became metallic, and Elias knew the entity was right outside the storage room door. Having followed him perfectly through the pitch black, the calm voice was gone. Only a terrifying, raw whisper filled the void. "We are fused, Elias. You cannot hide from yourself." Next, Elias uses the reel-to-reel tape to create a flashbang, momentarily blinding the entity. He realizes the key is designed to unlock the core relay transmitter, which he needs to set a timed charge for the ultimate choice, a localized explosion, anchor, or a wide-field pulse, relay. The sudden, absolute darkness was suffocating, amplifying the guttural hum of the witness just beyond the door. Elias dropped the dead flashlight, relying on his other senses. The air was thick with the scent of volatile, old dynamite and the sharp, coppery tang of raw energy. You cannot hide from yourself. Elias knew the entity could perceive him perfectly, using the residual electrical impulses of his own nervous system as a thermal map. He had to disrupt that connection. He needed a blast of physical energy, not just light, but an intense surge of chaotic frequency, to momentarily scramble the witness's perception that he reached into his backpack and pulled out the only non-electronic item he had left, the reel-to-reel tape labeled Danger. The magnetic tape itself was a dense archive of signal chaos and human terror. He tore off a large section of the tape, ripping it into long strips. He quickly pulled out a piece of old, rusty rebar from the doorframe and used the static energy created by rubbing the magnetic tape against the metal to generate a tiny, faint spark that he then aimed the tape strips at the nearby boxes of dynamite. No, too risky. Too final. He remembered the final, blinding shriek of white noise recorded on that tape. He needed to recreate that burst of chaotic signal. He quickly wadded up the remaining tape, forming a tight, dense ball. He found a small, heavy mining hammer on the floor and brought it down hard on the rebar, producing a strong, incandescent spark. He threw the wad of magnetic tape directly at the spark. The tape did not ignite with fire. Instead, it detonated with a furious flashbang of pure static. A silent, brilliant white light erupted in the room, accompanied by a deafening, invisible shockwave of chaotic, unfiltered frequency. Elias squeezed his eyes shut and shielded his face. The sound was non-auditory, a screaming pressure in his sinuses and skull. The witness screamed outside the door, a sound like 1,000 analog TVs simultaneously tuning out, and then the hum vanished. The static flashbang had worked. The entity was momentarily stunned, its perception system scrambled by the burst of raw frequency. Elias immediately fumbled for a stick of dynamite and a length of dusty, black fuse wire. He was running out of time. The witness would regenerate its perception quickly. He found a powerful stick of TNT and a long, reliable fuse. He didn't have a blasting cap, but he didn't need one to destroy the anchor. He simply needed a massive thermal overload. He grabbed the modified explosive and started running back up the shaft, toward the upper passage leading to G-14. As he ran, the confident, calm voice of the witness returned, now sounding ragged, furious, and overlaid with the sickening crackle of static burn. You choose the bomb. You choose annihilation. You waste your life. I choose neither yet. Elias yelled back into the darkness, his voice echoing fiercely. I need the relay for the pulse. He reached the crossroads and scrambled up the steep, ascending passage to G-14. The climb was brutal, but the air was getting fresher, signaling his ascent out of the deep earth. After what felt like an hour, the tunnel ended in a heavy, steel security door, reinforced and locked. Elias jammed the brass key, the key he ripped from the petrified scientist's hand, into the complex, antique lock. It clicked open perfectly. He pushed the door open into the G-14 relay station. It was a small, high-tech shack perched precariously on a ridge overlooking the entire Mojave field, the only place with an unobstructed transmission line to the sky. The room contained a single, massive console dominating the center, the G-14 transmitter core. It looked like a smaller, far more advanced version of the beacon. On the console, a red light blinked steadily next to a control panel with two massive, illuminated buttons: activate pulse, field collapse, activate anchor detonation, localized implosion. Below the buttons was a timer, currently set to 00:00:00. Elias realized the grim reality: the brass key wasn't just for the door. It was the activation mechanism for the final, devastating choice. The entire relay was a failsafe, ready for the user to make the ultimate decision. He had to choose: sacrifice himself to destroy the entity forever, or save himself and risk the entity returning to prey on others. He placed the stick of dynamite next to the detonation button. The fuse was long. He looked at the two options. The witness needed him alive. If he chose to detonate the anchor, he guaranteed the entity's destruction, but he would be at the center of the implosion, the beacon broadcasting its last signal. Suddenly, the transmitter core screen flashed violently. The chaotic image of the witness appeared, clearer and more detailed than ever, staring at him. The voice was no longer a whisper or a roar. It was a clear, calm, synthetic replication of his own voice, speaking the words of temptation. Choose the pulse, Elias. We will leave the field. You will be a hero. You can finish your thesis. You can go home. Elias stared back at the screen, at the thing wearing his voice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone, which still had the lock screen message. Elias, that he saw the fear in the witness's eyes, the fear that he would choose annihilation. That he picked up the brass key, the key the dead man sacrificed his life for, and inserted it into the timer slot below the 2 buttons. The timer immediately flashed. 5 minutes. 5 minutes until the final activation. Elias had 5 minutes to make his choice. Next, Elias realizes the 2 buttons are a psychological trap. He uses the relay's power to create a frequency loop with the dynamite, anchor, and the transmission dish, pulse, creating a third, unforeseen choice, the dimensional feedback loop, forcing the witness to consume its own signal. The countdown timer flashed crimson, 00:04:45. Elias gripped the brass key, sweat dripping onto the control panel. He stared at the 2 illuminated buttons, pulse, survival, and detonation, sacrifice. The witness, frozen on the screen, watched him through his own reflected eyes, projecting calm temptation. You can go home. He knew the witness was banking on his survival instinct. But the anchor detonation was too final, too messy, and guaranteed his death. The pulse was a temporary solution that preserved the anchor and allowed the entity to wait for the next beacon. Elias realized the true nature of the trap. The project team designed a failsafe with only 2 outcomes, containment or suicide. They never considered a third way. That he looked at the powerful transmitter dish visible through the window, the relay. It could send a signal. He looked at the unstable TNT stick, currently sitting next to the detonation button. That was raw, localized energy. The witness is a signal that consumes chaos and broadcasts through coherent media. If the witness was forced to consume its own signal, amplified through a closed loop of chaos and coherence, it would be forced to destroy itself. Elias, the engineering student, saw his third option, the dimensional feedback loop. He ripped the stick of TNT from the panel. The witness image on the screen shrieked a silent burst of static. Realizing the plan had changed. He ran to the exterior window, opening the latch. The massive, parabolic dish of the G14 relay station sat just outside, humming with standby power. First, he needed chaos. He pulled the long fuse on the TNT stick and quickly ignited it using a small, short-circuited wire he ripped from the console. The fuse began to sputter and burn. 00:03:50. He had to work fast. He secured the burning dynamite stick deep inside the parabolic dish's focal point, where the signal was generated, a chaotic, violent input right at the relay's core. Second, he needed coherence. He ran back to the console, pulling his backpack off. He ripped the danger reel-to-reel tape out, the one that recorded the terrifying final sound of the scientist. He frantically disassembled the transmitter core's main audio input jack and spliced the 2 wires into the reel-to-reel tape machine. He didn't press play. He simply positioned the spool so the magnetic tape itself was bridging the connection, creating a passive audio conduit for the terrifying, chaotic signal of the anchor's implosion. The witness, realizing what he was doing, blasted a direct threat at him. The air filled with the scent of burning hair, and a wave of heat hit him, but Elias didn't flinch. 00:02:45. He slammed the relay's main power switch. The large parabolic dish outside roared to life, generating an immense, focused beam of invisible microwave energy pointed straight up at the atmosphere. The transmitter screen instantly displayed a new, flashing message, transmitting. The witness screamed, its image contorting into a knot of black pixels and needle fingers. You are collapsing the beacon. You will be destroyed by the inversion. Elias ignored it. He grabbed the brass key and pressed it hard into the activation timer slot. The timer changed color to green, but kept counting down. 00:01:50. He ran to the console and simultaneously slammed his hands onto both buttons, activate pulse and activate anchor detonation, the relay screamed a single, high-frequency tone. The dual activation didn't cause an immediate collapse, but instead, the system did something completely unintended. A self-contained, closed frequency loop was created. The signal chain was TNT explosion, chaos, relay dish, coherence, atmosphere, broadcast, reel-to-reel tape, feedback, transmitter core, consumption. The system was broadcasting the sound of its own destruction back into its heart. 00:00:58. Elias backed away from the console as the TNT fuse burned down to its end. The floor began to vibrate, and the air crackled with blue lightning. The witness image on the screen collapsed, dissolving not into static, but into a black, swirling vortex. The entity was being drawn toward the signal of its own destruction, forced to consume the feedback. 00:00:15. The stick of dynamite exploded in the dish with a sound that wasn't a bang, but a colossal, shattering crack of pure, distorted frequency. The entire relay shack was plunged into blinding white light. The last thing Elias saw before the final shockwave hit him was the transmitter core screen, where the vortex of the witness was rapidly shrinking. It wasn't screaming. It was silent, imploding as it swallowed the signal loop. 00:00:00. The world went white, then black. Next, Elias wakes up in his truck miles away, the Whisper Creek facility gone, replaced by a massive, perfect circle of fused black glass. He finds a final, cryptic file left on his laptop by the witness, and realizes the entity is still alive, hiding in plain sight, and it knows where he lives. Elias woke up to a throbbing headache and the smell of ozone, his body aching on the rough, dusty seat of his truck. The sun, a brutal orange disk, was just beginning to crest the horizon that he sat up, disoriented. He wasn't at G14. He was parked back on the open desert road, the engine off. The truck's windshield was still a spiderweb of cracks, but the static wall was gone. The rhythmic thumping in his head had ceased. That he looked behind him. Where the Whisper Creek facility and its massive transmission tower had stood, there was now only a vast, flat expanse of desert. That in the center of that expanse, precisely where the tower base had been, was a colossal, perfectly circular patch of obsidian, huge, fused disk of black glass. The dimensional feedback loop hadn't collapsed the field, it had imploded the anchor, sealing the wound with the witness's own solidified presence that he had survived. He had destroyed the anchor. Elias checked his backpack. The reel-to-reel tape was gone, melted away by the intense frequency charge. The backpack smelled of burnt plastic. That he started the truck and drove, not stopping until he reached a small, run-down diner 50 miles away. He ordered coffee and toast, the food tasteless in his mouth. That he took out his laptop, the same one he had planned to write his thesis on, and connected to the diner's spotty Wi-Fi. He needed to report the incident, though he knew no one would believe him. As the laptop connected, a notification popped up on the desktop, a single, unread file. It was a text file titled, debrief.log. Elias's hands trembled as he opened it. The file was short, written in the same concise, authoritative tone as the witness's calm voice. Debrief log. Subject, Elias Thorne, Beacon Number 3, Status, Mission compromised. Field collapsed. Anchor neutralized. Analysis, Subject exhibited self-sacrificial deviation from programmed containment protocols, Option 1 and 2. Subject introduced chaotic energy, TNT, into the coherence pathway, G14 transmitter, to create a forced feedback loop. Highly unstable, yet effective. Result, the witness entity was forced to consume its own broadcast signal, causing a localized dimensional implosion. The anchor is destroyed. Containment failure has resulted in signal dispersion. Conclusion, the entity is not destroyed. It has fragmented and diffused into the universal, ambient static frequency, the noise between stations, the visual snow on dead screens, the background hum of the internet. It is now everywhere, but weak and dispersed. Mistake, Project Beacon was focused on receiving the signal. It should have been focused on filtering it. Warning, the witness knows its true threat is the individual coherent mind. It knows where you sleep. It knows your digital signature. Assignment: do not seek further relay stations. Do not attempt further contact. Do not attempt to fix what you broke. The witness will eventually reform. Until then, you are the most coherent source of its memory. Location remains, 1240 N, University, apartment 4B. Elias dropped his coffee cup. 1240 N, University, apartment 4B was his apartment address back home, over 1,000 miles away. The witness, even dispersed, knew his exact location. He looked up from the screen, scanning the diner. The old cathode ray TV mounted high on the wall was flickering through dead channels, displaying a pure field of swirling, chaotic white noise. The witness was no longer a towering silhouette in the desert. It was the static. It was the noise. It was the ever-present background hum of existence. Elias quickly shut the laptop, snatched his keys, and bolted out of the diner. He didn't pay. He didn't care that he drove for 2 days straight, the reel of the 1978 log permanently etched into his memory. He didn't turn on the radio, kept his phone on airplane mode, and avoided looking at any screens. He finally reached his city, pulling up to his small apartment building late on a Sunday night. He climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, his hand shaking as he inserted his key into the lock of apartment 4B. He pushed the door open. Ready for anything, a physical attack, a projection, a warning. The apartment was dark, silent, and exactly as he had left it. A sense of profound relief washed over him. He was safe. He collapsed onto his bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the trauma, trying to forget the feel of the black glass and the smell of the peanut butter sandwich. His laptop was still in his bag. He knew he should destroy it, but then, he noticed something strange about his bedroom. On the far wall, where a cheap, store-bought digital clock was plugged into the socket, the numbers were not illuminated. The clock face was black. He